And so, after that, let me regale you with the tale of the marvellous, magnificent storytelling machine. The Count Ulrich von Strom ruled over a fiefdom so large that even he had never travelled its entire boundaries. It would take many, many days to travel from one side of this fiefdom to the other. He lived with his wife, the Countess Una von Strom, and their young daughter, the Comtessa Erika von Strom, in the castle von Strom. Now, if you'd seen this castle, you would have been forgiven for thinking that he was perhaps an avaricious or a greedy man, because the castle was magnificent, built on the side of a hillside, towers reaching up into the sky, and down the landscaped hillside hanging gardens. The only word for it would be opulent, but not at all. He was regarded by his people as a fair and just ruler, and the fiefdom prospered under him. The castle overlooked a city that was a bustling centre of commerce. The universities of this city were attracted scholars from all over the world, from all four corners of the earth. And airships plied the skies. Trains and ships brought spices and merchants from foreign countries. It was an exciting place to be. It was a prosperous place to be. And the Count and his family were much loved by the people of the city and by the people of the entire fiefdom. But there was a deep sadness in the heart of the people, and there was a deep sadness in the heart of the family von Strom. And the sadness was this: their daughter, Erika, who was deeply loved herself by the people because she was a generous-hearted child, she was a noble child, and when she was younger she used to go into the streets of the city and she would play and she would be happy and joke with anybody. But as she grew older, a sickness overcame her. Nobody knew what this sickness was, but the older she became, the more ill she became, pale and thin. She lost weight until eventually she found that she could barely get out of bed. The family obviously called in all sorts of doctors. They had their own alchemist, the court alchemist, who was appointed to the family and appointed to care for the daughter. And he had tried all sorts. He had tried mixing potions and lotions and herbs that were so foul that when she tasted them, made her turn green and vomit. He had mixed up fumes that she'd had to hold her head over a bowl and inhale that made her feel sick. He'd gone as far as sticking pins in her in the manner of the physic of the East, all to no avail. She became iller and iller. And so desperate were they that they called out across the fiefdom, across the city, for anybody who could cure her. And they attracted all manner of quacks. They attracted all manner of strange cures. People who advised that she'd be kept warm, that she'd be kept cold, people that advised that she'd be bloodlet. But nothing made the slightest bit of difference. And eventually the family and the city, the people of the city, came to terms with the idea that the young Comtessa was likely to die. She was now at the stage where she could barely get out of bed. Now, this time, there was a young serving girl who worked in the castle, and she recalled from her childhood a storyteller, a teacher, back in her village, where she'd grown up. And this man, known only by the name Jasper, was teacher to all the children there, but was known most for his storytelling. And it was said of him that his storytelling was so rooted in the land, and that it was so rooted in the people, that it had a miraculous healing quality. And so she sought out the Comtessa's manservant, and she told him what she remembered of her old teacher, the storyteller. And the manservant was quite excited about this, and he brought the serving girl to the count and asked that she recount the story to him, and she did. The count instantly begged her to return to her home village and bring back the storyteller. He said, if you were to do this for me, and if we could make any difference to my daughter's life, I would repay you handsomely. The only thing that I would ask for, said the serving girl, would be an improvement in the young Comtesse's well-being. That would make me happy. That would be the only reward that I would seek. But I will happily return back to my home village and see whether I can fetch the storyteller. And so the count arranged for a carriage, and the manservant and the serving girl left the city and headed off to the serving girl's home village. Now this home village was many, many days' journey away. They journeyed over mountains, they journeyed across rivers, they journeyed across barren plains. But eventually they arrived back at the girl's home village. And she rode the carriage into the village and up to the village square. And in the village square, there, just as she remembered it from her own childhood, there was the storyteller, in the square, surrounded in the dust and in the dirt by the children. The village was in a beautiful part of the country. There were mountains at the side, it was in a valley, waterfalls, forests. And as they alighted from their carriage, she was delighted, her face lit up, when she realised that as the storyteller turned to look at her, he smiled with a smile of recognition. But had she but known, of course, any good teacher will remember every single one of their protégés, and he remembered her as well as the day that he had taught her. And as they approached him, she heard him speaking to the children the way that she remembered, and he was telling this story. In a city quite far from here was a young man called Kadur. Kadur was a sweet seller. More than a sweet seller, he was a sweet maker. And he would spend his evenings making sweets, and then he would go to the market and he would sell his sweets at those markets. Kadur was a generous-spirited man. He was a kind man, not the sort of man that often makes a very good businessman. And Kadur, unfortunately, all too easily found himself paying over the odds for his ingredients and selling under the odds for his goods. And eventually, Kadur was becoming poorer and poorer and poorer, until he had almost nothing left. He decided that the life of the sweet seller was not for him, and he thought he would go and seek his fortune elsewhere, leave the city. And so he packed up a rucksack, a small rucksack with his few remaining belongings, a few clothes, a piece of bread, something to drink, and a little red glass lantern. This little red glass lantern was something his father had left him, so it was the last thing that he had kept back. And he placed it in the rucksack with everything else, and he left the city. He made his way through from the city gates and eventually passed out of the jurisdiction of the city into a barren desert area. Through this barren desert area he travelled, became mountainous, and he travelled through the mountain passes. Now these mountain passes were renowned for bandits. But Kadur, by the grace of God, and probably from his visible abject poverty, was untroubled by the bandits, and eventually, after many days' travel, he came out the other side, and he beheld the most incredible city he had ever seen. Walls of pure white marble and minarets towering up into the sky, and he approached this city. And he knocked on the doors of this city, and they opened up. And he was welcomed in. And he was welcomed in as an honoured guest. The tradition of this city was that a foreigner arriving from afar was treated with the greatest hospitality, and he was ushered in and he was brought up and presented to the Caliph himself. He was feasted for 3 days. He was entertained. Poets, dancers, storytellers, singers. The finest of entertainment, the finest of food. He slept every night in the finest silk sheets. as was the tradition of that country. But after 3 days came and had passed, Kadir was slightly worried because he knew that the tradition was that it was then his turn to repay that hospitality. And he had no idea how could he possibly repay the magnificent hospitality he had received in this city. And he thought, well, I only have one thing of worth. And so when he was presented to the Caliph, he took from his rucksack, and terrified that he was going to offend the Caliph with his paltry gift, he presented him with the red glass lantern. But little did he know that they had never seen glass in this city. Their windows were just slits through which the wind howled through, and the sight of a little candle flame flickering through simple red glass was like a miracle to them. The Caliph was he had no idea how he could possibly repay this gift himself, because this gift completely outweighed the hospitality that they had bestowed upon their visitor. And so he decided the only thing that he could do was to present him with as much wealth as they could enable him to carry away from their treasury. And so the Caliph summoned his treasurers, he summoned his viziers, and he ordered them to bring forth 14 camels, and they laden these camels with spices, with gold, with silks, with the finest jewellery. And so Kadur rode out of the city, a very wealthy man. And he decided, well, in that case, I'm going to ride home. And he rode back home, and by the grace of God, again, he remained untroubled by the bandits. When he arrived home, he used his wealth, he decided he wasn't going to be a sweet seller anymore. He used his wealth, he bought himself a beautiful mansion, and he had an excellent life. He was a generous man, people liked him. Now, Kadur had a brother, Said. And as generous as Kadur was, mean and avaricious as Said. And as straightforward and see-through as Kadur was, as duplicitous was Said. And Said wanted to know where on earth this sudden wealth had come from. How had his brother made so good? And so he spent all of his time, every evening he would avail himself of his brother's hospitality, and his brother was generous. He was just pleased that Said was now showing an interest in him. He didn't see anything going on behind this. But whatever hints that Said dropped went straight over Kadur's head. And eventually Said got completely fed up, and he just asked him outright, where did this wealth come from? Where did this money come from? And Kadur laughed and said, well, why didn't you tell me? That's what he wanted to know. And he just told him the story outright, from start to finish. Well, Said's brain started working, and he thought, if we could get that much just for one glass lantern, imagine what I could get if I went there and I repaid them with the wealth that I've got as a successful merchant. And so he got together a caravan, laden his own wealth on this caravan, and he set out to travel to the city that his brother had told him of. They left the city, they left the jurisdiction of the city, and they entered bandit country. Bang! Instantly, they were surrounded by hundreds of bandits. He was beaten to a pulp, everything taken, left to die under a tree. Eventually, he was found by a family of nomads who cared for him and fed him and watered him, and he regained his strength and he continued on his way. When he got out of the plains, he made his way to the city that his brother had told him of, and he found the city exactly as his brother had described. Magnificent white marble walls, minarets leading, towering into the sky. And he approached the city gates and he knocked on the city gates, and he was welcomed in as an honoured visitor, as a foreign guest. They offered him the most magnificent hospitality. Again, he was feasted for 3 days solid. He slept in silken sheets. He was entertained by poets, by dancers, by storytellers. When the 3 days had passed, he himself, like his brother before him, was terrified because he no longer had anything with which to repay this hospitality. And then He reached into his pocket. And he thought, well, there's one thing left. And he found the only thing that the bandits hadn't found, which was an old battered watch. But what on earth would the Caliph make of such a gift? Terrified, he presented the Caliph with the old battered watch. But little was he to know that in this city they had never seen timepieces. They measured the time by the rising and the setting of the sun, and the watch was like a miraculous mechanism. And the Caliph looked at it, and the Caliph himself thought, how on earth can I possibly repay such a magnificent gift? And he racked his brains, and he thought, well, I've already given most of my wealth away to a previous visitor. It's very sad, but I actually only have one thing left of any value that I could possibly give our honoured guest. And so he clapped his hands and he summoned his viziers, he summoned the treasurer. And the viziers came out carrying a silken cushion. And upon the silken cushion was a red glass lantern, which was presented to Saeed, who had nothing to say, nothing he could say. And so he took the red glass lantern and he returned to the city a poorer, hopefully a wiser man than before. And he was untroubled on his return journey by the bandits, probably because of his highly visible abject poverty. And this was the story that Jasper told the children. And when he had finished telling this story, the serving girl ran up to him and he greeted her like an old friend. And she told him of the Comtesse's plight and how she was unwell and how she had told the Count of the stories that had been told about the stories of Jasper. And she begged him to return with her to the city and to tell his stories and to see whether he could possibly do anything to help the young Comtesse. Now Jasper was a storyteller, but he was deeply rooted in his village, he was deeply rooted in his people, and his stories, he knew, were told surrounded by the waterfalls, surrounded by the forest, surrounded by the mountains. But he agreed. He too had heard of the Comtesse's plight, and he too had come to love the family and the good that they did for the whole area. And so he joined them in the carriage and they returned back across streams, across rivers, through wild plains, over mountains, through mountain passes, until they returned to the city and until they returned to the castle von Strom. And so the storyteller Jasper was made welcome at the castle, and he was presented to the Count, and the Count presented him to the courtiers and to everybody at the castle, and he was asked to tell a story. This was the story he told there. If you are a dreamer, come in. If you are a dreamer, a wisher, a liar, a hoper, a prayer, a magic bean buyer, if you are a pretender, come, sit by my fire, for we have flax golden tales to spin. Come in, come in. And with that, my story shall begin. And a long time ago, many, many years ago, an old lady was making her way through a field. You could tell that she had travelled far. Her face was weathered brown, wrinkled like bark. She had walked for many days without food, without water. Her clothes were ragged and filthy. Her hair was matted, her fingernails broken and dirty. Her feet were bare and calloused. And she made her way wearily, bone-achingly wearily, through this field until she came out the other side. She approached a village. And when she approached this village, she went up to the first house that she found and she knocked on the door. And the door was opened by a young lady who said, "Yes?" What is it that you want? And the old woman said, please, if you could see fit, maybe to give me just a hunk of bread, a glass of water, so that I may gather my strength to continue on my journey. If it pleased you, possibly even 10 minutes, half an hour by your fire, just to warm these weary, achy bones. The woman looked at her in disdain. She said, get away from here, there's nothing for you here. And she slammed the door in the old lady's face. The old woman continued her way into the village, and she came to a shop. And she approached the shop. And as she approached the shop, the shopkeeper came straight out. He's like, what do you want? And she again said to him, please, if you could possibly just spare a hunk of bread or a glass of water, and possibly just an opportunity to rest. He said, get away from here, you're scaring my customers. Go away, you horrid old woman. And so she moved on. She continued up the street, and she passed a village green, upon which a bunch of young lads were playing. And as soon as they saw her, they turned, instead of fighting amongst themselves, they picked up stones and they picked up rocks and they just threw them at her, laughing at this crazy old lady as she walked past. She continued walking, wearily, increasingly tired, just looking for somewhere to rest for a few minutes. She passed the priest, who just crossed over the road and walked down the other side. And eventually she came to a bench on a small green with a trough for horses to drink from. And she bathed her face, cleaned the sweat and the dirt off her face with the water from the trough, and she sat down on the bench, just maybe to close her eyes for half an hour, gather her strength so that she could move on to the next village and try her luck there. But as she closed her eyes, she heard a noise coming from down the road from which she had walked up. And she looked down the street, and in the distance, she could see a horse with a young rider upon it. A magnificent horse, a grey stallion. And as it got closer, she could see the rider was a handsome young man with a flowing mane of golden hair trailing behind him. He had a cloak, a magnificent, huge purple cloak that was billowing behind him in the wind. And as he got closer still, she could see his clothes were beautifully brocaded silk. He had a waistcoat that, if you looked closely at it, appeared to move and contain patterns and shapes and figures. And as he rode into the village, every window up that street flew open. And people leaned out and they started chattering and they started talking to each other. And as he rode closer in, the doors flew open and everybody rushed out, and they were carrying trays full of meats, full of cheeses, bread, the finest flagons of wine, and they all gathered around this young man as he came to a halt. And they were all begging to offer him their hospitality, begging to offer him some food and offer him seat at their table. Well, this piqued the old woman's curiosity a little bit. And so once the fuss had started to die down, she made her way up to the side of the young man, and she attracted his attention in the only way that she could think of. She reached up and she just tugged at his cloak. And he looked down at her and said, yes, grandmother, what is it I can do for you? And she looked at him, puzzled. She said, excuse me, are you the king? And he laughed. He said, no, grandmother, of course, I'm not the king. She said, well, if you're not the king, are you the landlord here? He said, no, I'm not the landlord. The earth gives you that idea. She continued to look at him, and she was thinking, well, if you're not the landlord, maybe you're somebody's long-lost son who's been away at war for many years and everyone thought was dead, and you've just returned, and that's why they're all so overjoyed to see you. He said, no, I'm not nobody's long-lost son. She said, well, who are you then? He said, grandmother, my name is Story. And I've always found that wherever it is that I go, wherever I travel, people are always pleased to see me. Yeah, they want to welcome me into their homes. They want me to take a seat by their fire. They want to hear the words that I say. They invite me to their table. He said, why, grandmother? Who are you? "What's your name?" And she was quiet for a minute and she said, "Young man, my name is Truth. I've always found that wherever I go, nobody wants to welcome me into their home. Nobody wants to hear the words that I have to say. Nobody wants me to have a seat at their table." And so the young man thought about this for a while, and he looked at the old lady and he said, "Grandmother," he said, "you see this magnificent stallion upon which I'm riding?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, it's a strong beast. It's certainly strong enough for the two of us." And he said, "You see this beautiful cloak which keeps me warm in my travels?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Well, if you were to climb up here and sit behind me and wrap yourself in my cloak to keep yourself warm, maybe that way, wherever I go and wherever I'm welcomed in, you can go too. And that way, when people want to hear my words, they will have the opportunity to hear your words too." And that, my friends, is why until this very day, every single story that you will ever hear will contain more than just a little bit of truth. And so the storyteller finished his story. There was silence in the room for a minute, and then the young Contessa, who had been wheeled down in her wheelchair to listen to the first story of the storyteller, burst out laughing. She clapped her hands in joy. She had not made such an energetic movement in months. Her father was delighted. He insisted then and there on giving the storyteller a court appointment. From that day onwards, it was the job of Jasper to be the court storyteller solely to the young Contessa. And this he did with a glad heart, and from that moment onwards, day after day, the Contessa Erika von Strom started to become stronger. Her eyes became brighter, her face a little bit less pale. Eventually, they found that she was able to move and get out of bed a little bit more regularly. She regained her strength. Day by day, you could see a clear and marked improvement. And at that stage, I'm going to take the opportunity for a short break. And afterwards, I shall tell you about the development of the marvellous and magnificent storytelling machine and its eventual downfall. But right now, I shall have a drink. Emily will entertain you with another song.